Turning now to our speaker for the day, Brian Lepard is the Harold W. Conroy Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Nebraska College of Law. He teaches there international law, international human rights law, comparative law, and many other subjects. These are all great topics for Baha'is to teach. It seems to me a worldwide focus on law and the concern about justice. He also at one point worked at the Baha'i office at the United Nations for 3 years as a human rights specialist. He's written quite a few books on international law, comparative law, human rights, comparative religious law even, Baha'i law, and ethics. And two of his books published recently, one was Hope for a Global Ethic, Shared Principles in Religious Scriptures, and the other one, In the Glory of the Father, the Baha'i Faith and Christianity. So he's even branched out into my field of religious studies. A very, very capable fellow, and we're very much looking forward to hearing him today. So Brian, welcome very much to the Wilmette Institute's Web Talk series, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Well, I really appreciate your invitation to give us Web Talk, and thanks to everybody. So I'm very excited to be sharing some thoughts with you. Today, I would like to really explore some of my personal reflections on the nature and application of Baha'i law, but with the understanding that, like all of Baha'u'llah's revelation, it is a system the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. So let me just share with you a few, if we can go to the next slide. I thought I would share with you just an overview of my talk today. So first of all, I would like to just explore how we think about Baha'i law, and then briefly talk about how it's part of a system the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. Then I'd like to explore some of the many interrelated layers of Baha'i law. It's not really just one uniform body of law. And then move on and just briefly compare Baha'i law with other major legal traditions of the world. And then finally reflect on how this kind of understanding of the nature and different layers of Baha'i law, as well as these similarities and differences, can help all of us as Baha'is, whatever our professions, whether legal or not, better share the teachings and apply those teachings in the field of law. So that's where we're headed. We can go to the next slide then. So first of all, how do we think about Baha'i law? So I think we first of all have to recognize that whenever we hear the word law, all kinds of images come to mind, like a police officer arresting a suspect, like maybe filling out our taxes, dealing with tax law. So the first thing we really need to do is overcome our own biases based on the cultural norms that we have absorbed and the legal traditions of our own societies, and try to understand that the Baha'i law is really unique and that it stands apart from all of these existing human legal traditions, even though, of course, various aspects of it have similarities with those traditions. And of course, I will have a chance to explore just a few of those similarities, but also some of the differences as well as we go along. So first of all, we need to really see Baha'i law with our own eyes. And in general, Baha'u'lláh teaches us in the hidden words. He says, "The best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid," he says, "thou shalt see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shall know with thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor." So really, this is a fundamental principle that Baha'u'lláh has brought, that we need to investigate all things through our own eyes, but with the aid of justice. And so, again, that's the spirit in which we will approach looking at Baha'i law. Furthermore, as I have already alluded to, we need to understand that Baha'i law really is a system that human eyes have never seen before. It is not comparable to existing human bodies of law. And indeed, Baha'u'lláh in general says that his entire revelation is something that mortal eyes have never seen. He says, "Mankind's ordered life hath been revolutionized through the agency of this unique, this wondrous system, the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed." And clearly Baha'i teachings on law are part of this really distinguished and remarkable system that is truly revolutionary. So one of the ways in which it's revolutionary is that it is not just a system of law in the traditional sense that we're thinking of, that we think of with codes, with written statutes, with regulations, I mean, clearly all of those are pieces and parts of Baha'i law, but of course, Baha'u'lláh himself says and underscores in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, his book of laws, which is also referred to as the most holy book, think not that we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws. Nay, rather, we have unsealed the choice wine with the fingers of might and power. To this beareth witness that which the pen of revelation hath revealed. Meditate upon this, O men of insight. So what beautiful poetic imagery here, that his book of laws is not just a mere code. It is the choice wine and beareth witness to his entire revelation. So again, this illustrates the tremendous power of Baha'u'llah's legal system that he has revealed, but the fact that it also has a spiritual essence that distinguishes it from a mere code of laws. He also, of course, counsels religious leaders not to judge his revelation by the standards of their own traditions, the standards of their own legal systems. So he says, for example, say, O leaders of religion, weigh not the book of God with such standards and sciences as are current amongst you. For the book itself is the unerring balance established amongst men. In this most perfect balance, whatsoever the peoples and kindreds of the earth possess must be weighed, while the measure of its weight should be tested according to its own standard, did he but know it. So again, he's urging even religious leaders not to simply judge his revelation based on existing religious laws, existing religious perspectives. Again, underscoring how distinguished it is. So with that understanding in mind, I wanted to investigate what I perceive to be many interrelated layers of Baha'i law. And so there's not one uniform Baha'i law. And even if we look at the Kitab-i-Aqdas itself, the book of laws, we find in there many different kinds of laws. And if, of course, we look at the much broader ocean of Baha'u'llah's revelation, we see many, many different layers of law, all of which are interrelated, but which serve different functions. And so I've tried to identify a few of these layers. So one of them is Baha'i law that nevertheless articulates divine and timeless principles. So for example, the law of love, the golden rule. These are all laws that Baha'u'lláh has renewed from prior dispensations, and we know that they will always be part of the law of God. So that is a critical part of Baha'i law. But then also Baha'u'lláh has brought new social and spiritual laws that are intended for all of society now and in the future. So for example, he's proclaimed the equality of women and men, the independent investigation of truth. These are new laws that are universally applicable today. On the other hand, we have another layer of Baha'i law, which is those Baha'i laws that are binding only on Baha'is, those who have accepted Baha'u'llah's revelation. And those include many of the personal laws, and I'll give some examples shortly. So it's always important to distinguish which Baha'i laws were intended only for Baha'is and which are intended for all of society. Another layer of Baha'i law relates to the Baha'i administrative order and the really remarkable and unprecedented system that Baha'u'lláh has given us for managing the affairs of the Baha'i community, and we know ultimately the world community. So we have many laws that pertain to the functioning of local spiritual assemblies and national spiritual assemblies and regional Baha'i councils, and of course, the Universal House of Justice itself. Yet another layer of Baha'i law involves Baha'i teachings about what we might think of as secular law, national law as well as international law. And so many of the teachings directly relate to the secular legal order. And in fact, the Baha'i writings have a lot to say about how the nations of the world should regulate themselves through their legal systems, as well as how globally nations should be cooperating to develop an international law that facilitates their mutual peace as well as universal human rights. And then finally, there are actually Baha'i laws and teachings on how we might reconcile potential conflicts between Baha'i law and national or international law. So in the law world, we refer to such rules that deal with what happens when there's a conflict of rules as literally choice of law rules, or even conflict of law rules. And the Baha'i revelation contains those as well, and I'll just explore a few of those. So let's turn back then to this concept of elements of the Baha'i revelation that reflect divine timeless law, and then those that bring new spiritual laws. So Abdu'l-Baha tells us that the law of God is divided into two parts. So he explains that one of them is the fundamental basis that comprises all spiritual things. And he says that this is the law that does not change or alter. It's the Holy of Holies. It's the essence of the law of Adam and Abraham and Moses and Christ and Muhammad and Baha'u'lláh. And he says that this is the law that lasts through all prophetic cycles and will never be abrogated. And it includes laws relating to spiritual virtues such as faith and knowledge and certitude, piety, righteousness, trustworthiness, purity, detachment, patience, showing mercy to the poor, defending the oppressed, uplifting the fallen. You can find these teachings in all of the world religions and all of the revelations of God. By the way, a theme that I have explored in the book Hope for Global Ethic. And so these are laws that Baha'u'lláh has absolutely and emphatically renewed. And yet at the same time, Abdu'l-Baha explains that there's a second part of the law of religion, which refers to the material world. And as he said, this comprises fasting, prayer, regulations about worship, marriage and divorce, abolition of slavery. Specifically, he mentions legal processes, transactions, indemnities for murder, punishments for various crimes. And he says this part of the law of God is in fact modified in every prophetic cycle in accordance with the needs of the times. And so Baha'u'lláh obviously has brought many new social laws of this nature, and especially in the Kitab-i-Aqdas itself. And again, we are familiar with many of these. So let's just go back to some of the social laws. And by the way, just to be clear, these laws that are brought for today, many of them are intended to be universal and to be binding on all societies. So a few examples are the equality of women and men. This is not just a law for Baha'is and their relationships with one another. This is a law for all of humanity. The law of independent investigation of truth is a law for all of humanity and not just Baha'is. The same is true for harmony of science and religion, for universal education, for eliminating all forms of prejudice, for eliminating all forms of racial discrimination, and for, of course, eliminating all forms of religious prejudice. These are all laws intended for all of humanity and to apply now. And so that is important to understand that these are laws of universal application. Now, what's interesting is if you look at prior revelations, there were also new laws that were brought that were intended to be of universal application. And so, for example, in the era of Moses, we have the so-called Noahide laws, the laws that were intended to apply to not just followers of Moses, but to all of the descendants of Noah, which is all of humanity, which includes, incidentally, the requirement to set up courts of justice to ensure that everybody has their day in court and access to justice. So every revelation then contains these laws for humanity, but of course we know that in Baha'u'llah's revelation, these new universal laws are intended to help bring about the true unification of the entire human race as one family. And so we need, therefore, not only to implement these new laws, but to really revisit and, if necessary, abrogate existing laws that are inconsistent with this vision of global unity. So as Shoghi Effendi explains, the call of Baha'u'lláh is primarily directed against all forms of provincialism, all insularities and prejudices. If long-cherished ideals and time-honored institutions, if certain social assumptions and religious formulae have ceased to promote the welfare of the generality of mankind, if they no longer minister to the needs of a continually evolving humanity, let them be swept away and relegated to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrines. And then he goes on to say, why should these in a world subject to immutable law, the immutable law of change and decay, be exempt from the deterioration that must needs overtake every human institution? For legal standards, he says explicitly, political and economic theories that are solely designed to safeguard the interests of humanity as a whole. and not humanity to be crucified for the preservation of the integrity of any particular law or doctrine. That's very, very strong language the Guardian uses to highlight the fact that we really need to re-examine our legal standards as well as our political and economic theories, and understand that we need to reform them to uphold the unity of the entire human planet. And so that is a theme that I will, by the way, return to just a little bit later. So let me then, of course, also mention that there is that third layer of Baha'i law, which are those social laws that are not intended to be universally binding right now, that are binding only on Baha'is, those who have accepted the truth of Baha'u'llah's revelation. And of course, those include the law of fasting, which we're of course about to observe starting on March 1st, the law of obligatory prayer for Baha'is, the law of Huquq'u'lláh, which is of course is a payment that we make, although we calculate the amounts ourselves in order to serve currently functions and purposes determined by the Universal House of Justice, but that are for the good of the world, ultimately. The prohibition on the consumption of alcohol, and of course the Baha'i law of marriage and divorce. And in this connection, I thought it was useful to reflect on the fact that as Baha'is, we accept to abide by these personal laws, but we don't seek to enforce them on society as a whole. I mean, obviously we believe it would be beneficial for everyone to accept Baha'u'lláh and abide by these personal laws, but at the same time, we approach these subjects with an attitude of humility, of focus on our own personal growth and development in observing them. And so in, for example, the case of a very controversial issue today, that of homosexuality, as well as homosexual marriage, which still, of course, involves a number of issues. One of them, of course, is the issue of respect for human rights, including freedom of personal choice. And so in 2010, the Universal House of Justice issued a letter in which it explained that our attitude as Baha'is towards people with a homosexual orientation should be one that is completely free of prejudice, and that moreover, because Baha'u'lláh exhorts us to be an upholder and defender of the victim of oppression, and because homosexuals have frequently been victims of oppression, it would be wholly appropriate, the House of Justice says, for us to come to the defense of those whose rights have been violated. But then it goes on to clarify, however, of course, that as Baha'is, we uphold Baha'u'llah's standards of personal conduct, including his law of marriage, which states that marriage is a sacred bond between a man and a woman, and that sexual relations are to be restricted to a couple who are married to each other. And therefore, for this reason, the practice of homosexuality is not permitted, just as the practice of extramarital sexual relations is not permitted. But importantly, the House of Justice clarifies that the teachings of Baha'u'lláh on personal morality are binding on Baha'is, who strive as best they can to live up to this high standard. And therefore, the House of Justice clarifies that it's important to understand that the Baha'i community does not seek to impose its values on others, nor does it pass judgment on others on the basis of its own moral standards. This is a very important principle. Obviously, there are many faith communities that are attempting to apply their own personal law to society as a whole, even in secular law. So again, I feel that this is helpful as a perspective to always reflect on what is the relationship between a particular Baha'i law and us as Baha'is individually, and then society at large. And then, of course, the House of Justice in that same letter goes on to indicate that we need to distinguish, of course, between those dimensions of public issues, including legal ones, that we can actively support and those we can't. And so, of course, it would be inconsistent for a Baha'i to adhere to a view as a Baha'i that marriage is restricted to a man and a woman, and at the same time, actively promote a view contrary to that. But at the same time, it may be more appropriate to, as the House of Justice suggests, take a more neutral perspective. And certainly as the House of Justice, that is the case for homosexual marriage. But it goes on to say, of course, when it comes to freedom from discrimination, we can be active advocates for the equal rights of homosexuals. So that brings us to yet another layer of Baha'i law, which is the Baha'i administrative order. And of course, this is a vast subject. I do not have time to, of course, go into all of the intricacies of this incredible order that Baha'u'lláh has brought, but we know that it is founded on spiritual assemblies who are houses of justice, beginning at the local level, where we have local spiritual assemblies elected by the believers every year according to their consciences, who have the virtues and qualities that they believe are best suited for them to serve as trustees for the welfare of the community. We have elected regional Baha'i councils, we have elected national spiritual assemblies, and then of course we have the Universal House of Justice itself, elected by the Baha'is of the world every 5 years. Of course, the rules by which these new institutions function are truly revolutionary. And even though we can find parallels with other existing legal systems, such as the fact that they are democratically elected, nevertheless, these elections are by secret ballot. They are free of campaigning. They are free of division. And then within each of these divinely ordained institutions, the method of resolving matters and questions is one that relies on open-minded consultation and with a common goal of serving the interests of the servants of God without regard to their own interests, as Baha'u'lláh himself highlights, even in the Kitab-i-Aqdas. And of course, we know that according to the Baha'i writings and the covenant, the Universal House of Justice has a unique role to play as legislator. And in the Constitution of the Universal House of Justice, it highlights its law-making powers. And among those are to enact laws and ordinances not expressly recorded in the sacred texts, to abrogate according to the changes and requirements of the time, its own enactments, to deliberate and decide upon all problems which have caused differences, to elucidate questions that are obscure, importantly, to safeguard the personal rights, freedom, and initiative of individuals, and to give attention to the preservation of human honor and to the development of countries and stability of states. And what's really fascinating about this statement of the functions of the House of Justice, to me at least, is how it highlights the multiple levels of law and guidance that the House of Justice is to provide. That it is the lawgiver as to laws not explicitly recorded in the sacred text. So it is a lawmaker. It can also, of course, abrogate laws that it has itself created. But it has this broader purpose as well, and to give attention to matters of national and international legal concern, such as human rights and human freedoms. And so we also have, therefore, a concern for the welfare of society on the part not only of the Universal House of Justice, but all Baha'i institutions, and for that matter, all Baha'is. I mean, this is, after all, the motivating theme of the process of community building that the entire Baha'i world is engaged in. So that then brings us, of course, I could say much more about the Baha'i administrative order, but just to highlight this framework of different layers of Baha'i law, we now have yet another layer, and of course I've just touched on it, which is Baha'i teachings about needed reforms in national law and international law. And so first of all, Abdu'l-Baha praises and recognizes the need for law, right? He says the law must reign and not the individual. Thus will the world become a place of beauty and true brotherhood will be realized. And so, again, we need law. And the writings of Abdu'l-Baha in particular make clear that national law should be just and that legislators should be high-minded and should in fact abide by timeless divine law. And Abdu'l-Baha beautifully expresses this in a book that he wrote for the people of Persia, The Secret of Divine Civilization, in which he addressed many, many legal issues. He addressed problems involving structure of government. And so among other guidance, he says that the elected members of parliaments should be righteous, God-fearing, high-minded, incorruptible. They must be fully cognizant in every particular of the laws of God, informed as to the highest principles of law, versed in the rules which govern the management of internal affairs and the conduct of foreign relations, skilled in the useful arts of civilization, and content with their lawful emoluments, i.e. Satisfied with their salaries, however meager those may be. But you see, he is, of course, highlighting that these legislators are not to serve their own personal interests. They are not to rule for their own benefit. They are, in fact, to exemplify these divine virtues and to rule for the benefit of the public and to, of course, also promote peaceful relations with other nations. So he is explicitly addressing then national parliaments and the qualities that should characterize their members. And again, he says that we indeed should set up democratically elected parliaments that should, of course, be concerned with the happiness of society and protect the rights of all mankind in accord with the divine law. So here he is referring to this timeless divine law that I first identified. And he referred to these divine laws as an impregnable proof against assault. And he says that adopting just secular laws that are consistent with divine law will ensure the integrity of the members of society and their equality before the law. So you see, we have an explicit then recognition that these vital elements of divine law also need to inform the deliberations of what we might think of as secular parliaments. So he again says that Parliament should, in fact, adopt human rights laws that protect everybody's human rights. Shoghi Effendi also, along with Abdu'l-Baha, addressed the rulers of Persia, among others, and highlighted some of the important elements that the legal system ought to contain. And so here's one example from a letter written in 1929, where Shoghi Effendi, for example, praised the introduction of Western-style codes, in particular a civil code. He praised the introduction of other legal reforms. And again, these included, among others, a systematization of the laws of marriage and laws of contract, laws of property, establishment of a land registry in Iran, distributing birth certificates that do not identify one's religion and therefore cannot be used as the basis for discrimination. He praised reforms in Persia aimed at enhancing the social rights of women and equality of women and men, enhancing the education of Persian youth. And he, again, praised all of these legal reforms as a way of helping to promote the ascendancy of Persia among the nations of the world. So again, we see him explicitly addressing a variety of secular laws and praising reforms aimed at bringing these more in line with timeless divine law, as well as, frankly, as you can see, with the new social laws brought by Baha'u'lláh, such as the equality of women and men. And Abdu'l-Baha also urged individuals to be vigilant in protecting their own human rights and not only the human rights of others. And in The Secret of Divine Civilization, he actually encouraged those who have been victimized by their governments to apply through legal channels to the local authorities for relief, to secure their rights, and even to take their cases to higher courts, to appeal them. He says this should be done in any case in which there is a deviation of the local law from the spiritual law. So again, we see not only this idea that national or local secular law should accord with spiritual law, timeless divine law, but that people should be educated to defend their rights and to take advantage of these procedures. He points out that unfortunately, because of inadequate education, many people don't even know their rights and don't even have the vocabulary to explain that their rights have been violated and to seek this legal help. So one of the reasons he says we need to educate people is so they can actually be better defenders of their own rights as well as the rights of others. And then that brings me to another element of the Baha'i teachings, which involve teachings on international law. So not only do the Baha'i teachings make these various recommendations for reform of national law, they have explicit teachings about international law. In fact, I have to say that when I was a young Baha'i, it was reading the World Order of Baha'u'lláh and learning about some of these Baha'i teachings about a world federation, the need for a world court, that really touched my heart, attracted my attention and engagement, and ultimately led me to pursue the career path that I have. And so one example, of course, is Abdu'l-Baha's teaching, building on Baha'u'llah's teaching about the need for a global collective security system to ensure the peace of every nation. Abdu'l-Baha says, once again, in The Secret of Divine Civilization, that true civilization will unfurl its banner in the midmost heart of the world, whenever a certain number of its distinguished and high-minded sovereigns, the shining exemplars of devotion and determination, shall, for the good and happiness of all mankind, arise with firm resolve and clear vision to establish the cause of universal peace. They must make the cause of peace the object of general consultation and seek by every means in their power to establish a union of the nations of the world. And here we have a very explicit reference to the need for a global treaty, right? Abdu'l-Baha says that they must conclude a binding treaty and establish a covenant, the provisions of which shall be sound, inviolable, and definite. They must proclaim it to all the human race. So, of course, we also know from the writings of Shoghi Effendi that we will ultimately have a true world federation voluntarily entered into by such a broad multilateral treaty, but that this treaty, among other things, and this entire federation and all of the treaties and agreements associated with it would guarantee the personal freedom and personal freedom and initiative of individuals, and would completely safeguard them. But it would also actually protect the basic autonomy of its state members. And so it would create a much needed balance between recognition of national autonomy, which today is glorified, elevated to a doctrine of almost absolute state sovereignty, at least in some countries. And it would balance that ideal with that of protection of individual freedoms and individual human rights. And of course, we are beginning to see the world struggles to create such a system that wasn't envisaged by Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi through such institutions as the United Nations. Of course, they have a long way to go, but they are embryonic efforts by humanity to implement this vision. And as Baha'is, knowing the ultimate vision, we can be engaged with them in helping them adopt needed reforms. And so at this point, I wanted to touch on the problem of resolving potential conflicts between Baha'i law and national law or international law. And so this is an opportunity to bring up a very important concept, which is the principle of obedience to national law. So Baha'u'lláh has taught us to be obedient to our governments, to be well-wishers, in fact, of our governments, as Abdu'l-Baha says in this quote. And really, we are only permitted to not obey national laws, to not obey our national government in matters of fundamental spiritual importance, obviously most importantly including our faith. So we will absolutely not renounce our faith. And of course, the incredible sacrifices of the Baha'is in Iran testify to their fidelity to this principle and to their commitment at great personal sacrifice to the revelation of Baha'u'lláh, and their refusal to deny their faith in the face of great pressure and intimidation by the government. But otherwise, they are law-abiding citizens. They are well-wishers of the government. They are active participants in building a more just and unified society. And so, again, this is a very important principle, that we do our very best to abide by national law and to support governments, except where fundamental matters of principle like faith are involved. For this, Shoghi Effendi says, of course, we must be willing to die. And then this, we're about, of course, to wrap things up with my formal presentation. I hope that everybody can still hear me, actually, since I can't tell for sure. But I would like to now just briefly turn to a comparison between Baha'i law and other existing legal traditions, maybe for about 5 minutes or so, and then I think we'll have a chance to break for some questions, which I eagerly await. So one is comparing Baha'i law with Western legal concepts and traditions. Another is comparing it in particular with the Western common law tradition that originated in England and in part has been adopted by the U.S., Canada, frankly, other former British colonies and dominions. I can briefly compare it with the civil law tradition, also of Western origin, that started in countries such as France and Germany, but is now common throughout the world. We can briefly compare it with other religious law traditions, including Islamic law, with indigenous law traditions, and then finally with contemporary international law. That's a tall order. This could be an entire course, So let me just touch on a few key points. So one, of course, is that those of us who are Baha'is in the West, like myself, understand that there are many elements of the Baha'i teachings that are quite liberal, quite consistent with ideas of individual freedom, including freedom of expression and freedom of thought. Many of these are very praiseworthy. Obviously, we've already seen that Abdu'l-Baha counsels parliaments to be democratically elected. This is consistent with Western notions of liberal democracy. So Abdu'l-Baha, for example, praises the need for freedom of speech along with freedom of conscience. And he says this is a fundamental human right, that every man, according to his own idealization, may give expression to his beliefs. He says without this, development and growth are not possible, but with them, they are inevitable. However, we also know that this right can be abused, that freedom of expression can be taken to extremes, especially when it is not motivated by a recognition of our fundamental unity and by the principle of consultation. And so the Universal House of Justice, including in a very important letter dated December 29th, 1988, has clarified that because speech is so powerful, it requires great judgment and it requires moderation and the exercise of prudence, and it requires checks and balances. And so the Baha'i perspective on freedom of expression, although fundamentally sharing commonalities with the Western ideal of liberty, is nevertheless different. It's a system the like of which more lives have never witnessed. It balances that freedom with recognition that we need to be moderate in our speech and loving in our speech and respectful in our speech. And of course, this is a big issue today with the problem of hate speech. Very briefly, of course, there are common law traditions where law, at least in part, is made through decisions of judges. There's an inherent flexibility in the common law tradition. We find this too in the Baha'i consultation process that assemblies engage in, but with many differences, of course, such as the fact that assemblies deliberate in light of Baha'i principles, whereas common law courts, of course, develop their own doctrine that was purely secular and detached from divine law. There are some similarities with civil law traditions that focus on codes, particularly civil codes, such as that of Napoleon. Again, we obviously have Baha'u'llah's Book of Laws, which could be viewed as a kind of code, but it's not, as he said, we saw, a mere code of laws, right? It is the choice wine. And so, in fact, we need to recognize, again, that this is very different from traditional Western codes. And Roshan Danesh, and I'm so happy he's going to be giving the next web talk, emphasizes this point in really a brilliant essay he wrote called Some Reflections on the Concept of Baha'i Law, which, by the way, has been reproduced in a great book that he's written of his essays called Dimensions of Baha'i Law. So he clarifies, right, that we are not just associating it with a rigid code of laws, and that Baha'i law is a pathway to spiritual fulfillment. Also, there are key differences with Islamic law and traditional religious law. So as Roshan Danesh also emphasizes, right, Baha'u'llah's treatment of law, it really is a sharp break from the tradition of Islamic law, which was very rigid, which was highly codified, which prescribed a whole variety of actions, ranging from things you absolutely must do every day, even the most minute aspects of life, to things that are recommended, to things that are neutral, to things that are discouraged, and finally at the opposite end, to that is absolutely prohibited. And there was a very, very rigid way then of categorizing rules and laws in the Islamic legal system that developed. But Baha'u'lláh really made a sharp break with that entire system and changed the whole legal imagination. I think that is what he'll be talking about in his next web talk. We also find similarities and differences with indigenous law. So there are some really fascinating similarities between the way that assemblies consult and the way that indigenous tribal councils consult, right? They really have developed a principle of consultation in decision-making. The example you see on the screen is of Gacaca in Rwanda, where if someone is suspected of a crime, then the community consults about how to solve it. And so we can draw inspiration from these indigenous law ideas, but of course there are differences in Baha'u'llah's revelation. Obviously, our deliberations on assemblies are grounded in Baha'u'llah's teachings and Baha'u'llah's law, and we have that common point of reference, along with the search for consensus by openly and open-mindedly listening to the views of others. And of course, even though contemporary international law is protecting many values that Baha'is promote, such as human rights, of course, it's still a secular process and institution that still elevates national sovereignty. And so there are many reforms then that we can recommend in the international legal order. So finally, to conclude, and I know it's been a bit longer than I originally promised, and I look forward to your questions. I'm seeing some questions rolling in my chat screen here. So how can this understanding that I've sketched help us as Baha'is, regardless of our profession, whether we're lawyers or in any legal-related profession or not? So first of all, I think it can help us better understand the importance of striving to fulfill our personal obligations to follow Baha'i law as Baha'is, by understanding it's not a mere code of laws. It's this choice wine that leads to our spiritual enlightenment, to our spiritual fulfillment of our spiritual purpose. This gives us a new perspective on Baha'i law that may be obscured by our traditional view of law as a command, right, backed by a threat, like go to prison. Obviously, too, it gives us new tools to share Baha'i law's revelation with others as part of the community building process. And if we understand, for example, the distinction between divine law and the social laws that are intended to be universal and those that are just for Baha'is, this, I think, can help us build bonds with people of different faiths, including those who are not religious, and reassure them in many ways, including the concept that Baha'i personal laws only apply to Baha'is and that we don't seek to impose them on others. We obviously hope to enlighten them, but we don't seek to impose them on others. I think that this understanding can help us be more effective participants in Baha'i administration, such as spiritual assemblies. Again, as I said, we can share with others differences between the Baha'i approach to law and those of other religious traditions that are quite different, as I've already highlighted. I think it can help us escape from the bonds of our own thinking because of our culture and our own biases about law based on our national legal systems, and truly understand how Baha'i law's system stands apart and above and really distinct from all of these. And of course, at the same time, however, it can help us develop ideas for advocating for reform of national and international law in light of Baha'i teachings. And thankfully, we have guidance from institutions like the Baha'i International Community on how to approach our governments about some of these issues that involve international law, from our national spiritual assemblies about interactions with national legislators about national law. Most importantly, of course, to conclude, I hope that this perspective will help us see that Baha'i law's teachings related to law really are part of this wondrous, this unique system, the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. So with that, I'd love to hear your questions and comments. I hope you've been able to hear me without too much trouble. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, we could hear you fine. We had no problems after that initial sort of minute or two of scratchy sound. So I'm glad to say that worked out.
That's really a relief. Well. I was worried that I was talking and nobody was hearing a word. So that's
you can be sure if there was a problem, we would have spoken up too.
Okay, good. Well, I kind of was checking my email to see if there was some urgent message being sent by email. So glad that worked out. Thanks.
It worked out very well. Very well. Thank you very much for this presentation. I found the idea of layers of law really helpful, thinking about the fact that there's just so many different ways of comparing Baha'i law to other things, international civil, all these common law and such. And the fact that the laws themselves are in layers of things that are binding, are social principles binding on Baha'is, personal laws binding on Baha'is, other things that are perhaps binding on entire society if we can manage to help people to move in the direction of equality of men and women and freedom from prejudice and such. So I found that a very, very helpful set of distinctions. One thing that occurred to me, when people say, we can never have an international government, any kind of world system, I think the answer to that is, so you don't believe in the rule of law? I mean, after all, we're talking about the rule of law. You believe in the rule of law in your city, in your state, in your country, but you don't believe the rule of law in the world. Mm-hmm. The world can't survive without the rule of law at the worldwide level. We're going to continue to harm each other and steal from each other and then just simply pollute and destroy the commons if we don't have the rule of law at the international level. So this was very illuminating for me from that point of view as well. So thank you very much. We have one question here that I see that several people, of course, have said thank you for the balance. Thank you from Alaska. Thank you from the Ukraine, which is very
Oh,
nice.
wonderful. So we
Nice.
really did have a global audience.
Yes, indeed. It's always nice to see that too. One person says, does a future Baha'i legal system envision a Baha'i court? How will the Baha'i laws be enforced in society?
Very good question. Well, my understanding actually is that our spiritual assemblies, which are actually houses of justice, according to Baha'u'lláh, are in fact then nascent Baha'i courts, and that they already actually within Baha'i communities can serve court-like functions in the sense that they can deal with potential violations of Baha'i law. They can consult with the individual concerned. They can consult on appropriate responses. More generally, of course, they play a role in helping Baha'is who are experiencing marital difficulties. They are to seek to help the parties reconcile, but if not, they ultimately make a kind of judicial determination that there are irreconcilable differences between the parties to the marriage, and therefore that a Baha'i divorce is warranted. So already they perform what we would think of as law-like, very much law-like functions. But of course, then the spirit and method of deliberation of a spiritual assembly can be quite different from that of a secular court. But I think obviously then at the global level, the Universal House of Justice itself then will play this kind of function, and frankly already does. But we know that as more and more people become Baha'is, that the House of Justice will gradually assume a greater role in this area. Yeah, there are many fascinating dimensions of that question, but that would be the short answer, naturally. And of course, just more generally, we of course advocate for a global court, which would not be a Baha'i court. And I think you've alluded to that already. We can talk about that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to note the way things work at the national level, at least in the United States. If there's a question of a violation of Baha'i law, the National Spiritual Assembly ultimately makes the decision whether the person has violated Baha'i law sufficiently for there to be a sanction of some sort. But of course, they want a recommendation from a local assembly, and they have a staff to investigate and collect information from the various parties involved. And the staff, of course, is also aware of the full guidance of the House of Justice and is able to provide the National Spiritual Assembly with all the information they need to make a decision with reasonable speed. And of course, that can then be appealed up to the House of Justice as well.
That's right. Yeah. And I should make clear that even though it's the local assembly that may initially do fact-finding and make recommendations, it is the National Assembly that would have that authority. But as you said, that can be appealed to the Universal House of Justice. And it's fascinating to see the ways in which the Baha'i system really does reflect concepts of human rights, including a right to appeal, a right to further review, due process rights. You know, all of these are part and parcel of the Baha'i administrative order. And of course, we see many similarities then with similar concepts in secular legal orders, like rights of appeal. But of course, the entire process is motivated by spiritual principle, right, which does make it distinct. But I have seen situations where an individual who believed that an assembly made a wrong decision has first appealed it to the National Assembly and then even ultimately up to the Universal House of Justice, which at times can reverse those decisions. And there's a beautiful emphasis I see on really the value that's placed on individual rights in the Baha'i system. And the fact that every one of us as an individual ultimately has the right to seek guidance from the supreme body, the Universal House of Justice. And my understanding is it takes these appeals very, very seriously, and it has its own process, as you mentioned, for evaluating them.
Yep. Another question here: in the context of Baha'i law, what is the difference between a law and an ordinance? Is such a difference, if any, related to the levels of Baha'i law?
That is an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I have a clear answer to that. The Baha'i writings obviously refer to many ordinances. We saw that the Universal House of Justice in its constitution, which of course is then based on the Old Testament, Abdu'l-Baha, among others, talks about adopting ordinances. So I'm not sure that in Baha'i teaching there would be any clear, distinct meaning of ordinance, except that in the legal world at large, we might think of it as a more local law or a more specific law. So perhaps that's the term that's used in the Constitution of the House of Justice to distinguish the fact that it's the House of Justice that has legislated, as opposed to it being recorded in the sacred text, where we might call it a law. But there are also ordinances, we speak of Bahá'u'lláh, bringing ordinances as well involving conduct. And so I'm not sure that that's a meaningful distinction. It could just be a synonym.
Yeah, my impression is that they made us be synonyms in the Baha'i context, as opposed to, like you said, cities pass ordinances and not laws.
Right. Right.
Or states.
So sometimes it means it's of a lesser order, but I'm not sure that that actually is a fair characterization in the Baha'i system.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Another question, will there come a time when Baha'i laws will be taught in law schools?
Wow. Well, this is a fascinating question for me because at a number of levels. So first of all, it's fascinating for you, right? Because I know that the Wilmette Institute is, while it's not planning to operate a law school per se, that, we are building towards really a fully accredited educational institution that, presumably will offer courses on Baha'i law. In fact, I am,
yes.
you invited me to think about putting a
We're
course together.
Hoping to work on that.
Yeah, but in law schools now, I'm not sure if I'm aware of a course on Baha'i law. I will be frank and say that in my courses, which include the subject of comparative law, where I talk about religious systems of the world, I will bring up Baha'i law, and I will often mention Baha'i law. I actually did in class, I think on Friday. I mentioned Baha'i burial law because we're studying Islamic law, and I said each religion has its own laws about burial. So there are Muslim burial laws, and in the Baha'i Faith, there are specific burial laws. And so, obviously it can be taught already as part of a broader course on comparative religious law. But I look forward to that day, absolutely. Yeah, when Baha'i law could be a subject in law school. Clearly, it's a subject addressed in law journals. So Rashan Danesh has published a number of scholarly articles about Baha'i law in secular law journals. And I look forward to that day. But I think we can already make steps in that direction.
Sure. Well, there are already courses in Islamic law in some law schools too, I gather, so that people have some sense of where Muslims are coming from, especially where marriages are concerned, since as I understand it, Islamic law for marriage is often a contract thing. So those contracts presumably are enforceable or modifiable in a divorce situation in the West.
Yes, and more and more lawyers are going to be advising Muslim clients who will have such marriage contracts, which then raises fascinating questions about their interaction with secular marriage law. And one phenomenon around the world, less so in North America, is that of countries permitting religious law to govern marriage or divorce or even wills and succession to property upon death. They actually delegate those functions to religious courts. So it is entirely conceivable. This actually goes back to that question about a Baha'i court, that in some countries, at least eventually, Baha'i assemblies will actually be empowered by the national law to adjudicate marriage and divorce issues, as well as apply Baha'i law to matters of, succession upon death. So very interesting that so already we see religious law being implemented in these areas in many countries. Now in the West, we have more of a tradition of the secular law displacing such kind of religious law in matters of marriage and divorce. But this is a challenging issue for many societies. It's been challenging in countries like Canada, to a lesser extent in the United States.
And the United Kingdom too, where there's been, I gather, increased interest in allowing Islamic law to prevail in some cases.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, in fact, Shoghi Effendi made it a goal of the 10-year crusade to establish some Baha'i courts in Egypt and such. And of course, these goals became impossible to achieve because of circumstances.
Right.
Very interesting. I'm trying to think if there's another question I have, because I don't see any more questions right now. Well, we have a Q&A question. Let me see what's there. How different is the Baha'i conception of law distinct from the concept of aggressive advocacy, lawyers being advocates for clients and legal privilege?
Oh, yes. Yes, that is a wonderful and really important question. And of course, others have addressed this at greater length. But there are big differences, obviously, right, in the sense that in the Baha'i model, we are to be seeking the truth. We are not to simply be advocating for the interests of a particular person, client. And of course, in the Western world, this adversarial model of truth-finding and justice-seeking developed early on, including in England, including in Western Europe generally. And there was some notion that through the battle of these competing contentions, the truth would somehow emerge. But we know that actually the truth can lie in between those extremes, and that truth is often very nuanced, and it's not black or white at all. And so obviously in the Baha'i system, so first we recognize that we need truth-seeking mechanisms that are much more multifaceted, that are based on an open-minded inquiry without prejudice. And that's, of course, the model of fact-seeking that assemblies engage in. But also then when it comes to doing justice, we also know that there needs to be a process of consultation, of looking at what is just from many different angles. So again, I think this will require a real revolution, I think, in the Western world in adversarial models of dispute resolution. But thankfully, we're already seeing many steps in this direction with increased emphasis on mediation, on frankly, what's called restorative justice in the criminal justice system, where it's not about locking people up, especially younger people, but there's an effort to achieve reconciliation through dialogue between, perpetrator and victim. So we are definitely seeing a lot of movement in favor of what's often called alternative dispute resolution, which is very much in keeping with Baha'i principles.
Mm-hmm. Seems to me also that we, of course, have in the Kitab al-Aqdas the statement that the death penalty is an acceptable penalty for certain crimes, primarily murder and I guess arson that results in death of people.
Right.
But when you consider that in our current justice system, some fairly large fraction of people on death row have been proven to be innocent, then you have a very interesting issue of whether the death penalty is appropriate in our current society compared to perhaps a future society.
Absolutely. And I find it very interesting that this actually is an area where Baha'u'lláh explicitly leaves it to national governments to make this kind of determination. And that is in recognition of the fact that there are moral arguments on both sides, so to speak. Although clearly one element of the Baha'i perspective that is unique is that, as Baha'u'lláh and I believe Abdu'l-Baha emphasized, the murderer who does receive the death penalty will in effect be treated as having already paid his debts, whereas the murderer who didn't, will not. And so in the next world, there will be perhaps further some kind of divine punishment. And so, that's a unique element of the Baha'i view of the death penalty. But personally, for me, it's reassuring in the sense that I don't have to get involved in advocating for a particular perspective or approach. But what I can do as a Baha'i, particularly Baha'i lawyer, is highlight all of the moral considerations associated with application of the death penalty without making an ultimate judgment, but we can highlight the problem of execution of people who are innocent and the need to ensure that the criminal justice system especially treats people of minorities who are much more likely to be subject to the death penalty fairly. Mm-hmm. And these are all really important social issues that we can be actively engaged in, but obviously with the kind of moderation in our language and approach that the House of Justice counseled.
It's rather frightening to think that if a certain fraction of the people on death row have been shown to be innocent, how many people who've been given life imprisonment or 40 or 50 years for murder are also innocent? Maybe a larger fraction of them, and this is really quite a disturbing commentary on our modern legal system.
Well, and I think that this goes back to the earlier question about the adversarial system, because I think the adversarial system has huge problems in actually ascertaining the facts, including facts that are used to sentence someone to death, and that it can leave huge gaps. First of all, the prosecutors often view their job as to get a conviction.
Right.
In principle, they're supposed to seek to do justice, which includes, if they find exonerating evidence, then they are supposed to rethink their prosecution, if not drop it. But there's a culture that develops among prosecutors of, being zealous advocates, and it's the defense lawyer's job to bring up exculpatory evidence, and so there's very much that combative mindset, but that is extremely problematic in the context of a criminal prosecution of any kind, let alone one where someone's life is at stake. And so there we really need new mechanisms to bring to light all relevant facts. I always found it fascinating that in the civil law world, there's a tradition of complete review of the facts upon the first appeal. So there's a conviction, and then there's almost a new trial on appeal. And there is an opportunity to bring up new facts that weren't brought out in the initial trial. I thought, well, this is an interesting reform or practice from a Baha'i perspective, where the goal is to get out all the facts. And of course, it also reminds me that assemblies are always free to investigate new facts and revisit earlier decisions, which is very different from this Western model where the trial court decision is, at least in the common law tradition, given a great deal of deference, very hard to overturn. And so if that decision itself was a product of an adversarial proceeding that didn't fully bring out all the facts, that can severely disadvantage defendants, especially who are minorities, and have a lot of difficulty getting adequate defense help.
Yeah, we saw that in the recent movie Just Mercy, for example.
Yes, which we still need to see it. We've got the book. It's actually right here on the table, because it's a reminder that we absolutely also need to see the movie. Yeah,
it's a very good movie, and very chilling about miscarriages of justice. Not just that particular one, but others as well. And that particular effort to help people on death row has turned up quite a few wrongful cases of wrongful convictions. Another question here: since the local assemblies will be a future court of first hearing, will it be necessary for the members of the assembly to have received training in Baha'i law?
Well, I would say absolutely. And in a sense, already members of assemblies have an obligation to educate themselves about Baha'i law. The National Spiritual Assembly has produced a lot of guidance about Baha'i law for spiritual assemblies, including at least what used to be called guidelines for spiritual assemblies. But that essentially is, it's a pretty thick book, and it's really all about Baha'i law, and it has really specific guidance about Baha'i law and how assemblies are to approach, first of all, education of the believers about Baha'i law, and then secondly, potential violations of Baha'i law. So already assembly members do have an obligation to learn about Baha'i law. And I think sometimes there can be a tendency on assemblies to simply make decisions based on what we might call intuition or personal feelings. And actually, it should be routine for assemblies to be turning to authoritative guidance, including obviously from Bahá'u'lláh, Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, the Baha, but also from the National Spiritual Assembly, and should orient its consultations around the actual laws involved and the authoritative writings that we have.
Do you envisage a time when, let's say, a local Baha'i community has 50,000 members, not everyone in the society, but just a large number of people, like in Chicago, that a local spiritual assembly might have to have essentially a kind of court committee, a committee of people who handle 90% or 95% of the work of deciding what needs to be done, what needs to be enforced, or or such. To some extent, this is like a counseling committee because many assemblies that are large already have counseling committees.
Yes, actually, I was thinking of that same analogy. So that is very possible. And I know that one of the themes that we've discussed at gatherings of Baha'i lawyers that have occurred in various parts of the U.S. and abroad, including Canada, including through the ABS, include, how can lawyers be resources for their local spiritual assemblies? And I think it could be entirely appropriate for an assembly to consult with Baha'i lawyers in the community or outside the community in handling these kinds of matters. And I think you're right, especially as communities grow and the responsibilities of assemblies expand, they're going to need a lot more guidance from professionals. Now, obviously, there are all other issues where it's appropriate for the Baha'is as individuals concerned to hire lawyers and get legal advice relating to secular law. But as to Baha'i law, I think that Baha'i lawyers are in a unique position to educate themselves about that law, understand it, and potentially at least provide some kind of recommendations, be a resource for spiritual assemblies. Absolutely.
And related to that question is this one: can Baha'is be represented by attorneys when they take a claim before their local assembly for resolution?
I can't say I've ever had that experience, so I've never been asked to be an attorney. I don't think in serving on a number of assemblies, someone has ever done that. That is an interesting question, and I am not sure of the answer, to be quite frank.
I'm not sure what the point is exactly, since you don't, in that sense, need to have someone to advocate for you, since you're supposed to be able to advocate for yourself. But on the other hand, it might be helpful to have someone along with you to help remind you of certain points or certain spiritual principles. And I suppose that person could be a lawyer. I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think that as to matters of Baha'i law, obviously, and the procedure of the assembly in handling potential violations of Baha'i law, the guidance there would be the teachings, right? Baha'i law. And of course, a secular attorney would not be an expert in Baha'i law. I mean, unless they're themselves a Baha'i, which then they may well be. But I would think that it's more in keeping with the spirit of Baha'i approach to fact gathering that we wouldn't have it's not a formal procedure, right? And the assembly actually has quite a bit of discretion, unlike a court that has to follow procedures for evidence gathering, what is admissible evidence, and that's where lawyers can play a role in objecting that that's not admissible and so forth. We don't have any of those rules. Everything that's potentially relevant can be taken into account by a spiritual assembly. So I'm not sure there would actually be the same need or that it would be appropriate in that sense. So again, I don't know of any specific guidance on that. In the end, that would be the subject for the institutions, including the House of Justice, to opine about or to rule on.
That raises the interesting question of precedent in the Baha'i community, which of course plays a very important role in secular courts, but I gather plays a much smaller role in the Baha'i context.
Yes, that's right, which is a fascinating subject in itself. So we obviously know that in Baha'i administration, assemblies are always free to change their decisions, to reconsider them. They do not have to give any particular weight to their own prior decisions. They clearly do not have to give weight to prior decisions of other spiritual assemblies. And of course, when the doctrine of precedent evolved in the common law courts of England, this was its nature, that the problem was, it was perceived as a problem that judges around the land in England were coming up with different rules, and you never knew what rule would be applied when you went before a judge in your particular village or county. And so this doctrine gradually evolved that just to ensure some kind of harmony, that a judge would need to give deference, in fact, treat it as strictly binding if the facts were virtually exactly the same, either its own prior decision or a prior decision of any other judge throughout England. And this was the only way to create a harmonized body of law. So we clearly don't have that. Of course, what we have is a clear hierarchy of institutional authority in the faith, such that we don't really need a doctrine of precedent because we have authoritative guidance from the National Assembly, Universal of Justice. Even in the secular legal world, we sometimes loosely talk about binding precedent to refer to rulings by higher courts. A lower court has to follow a ruling of a higher court. In my view, that's not really an application of precedent. That's an application of the fact that it's a higher court, and it has authority, therefore, to bind the lower court. So clearly we have that system of authority in Baha'i administration, but not precedent. And I think that gives us tremendous flexibility. It is a big difference between our system and that of the common law world, where we are always free to revisit issues, to make changes. And that's very much also part of the process of reflection that goes on in our community building initiatives, where we have regular reflection. We can change our plans, our views, our perspectives. And that is true for assemblies as well, even in dealing with legal matters, Baha'i legal matters.
Yeah, that's very helpful for me because I didn't understand how precedents worked in common law. So that really.
Well, I think even lawyers get a little confused about it because we throw that term around precedent, and it can actually have many different meanings. But that was the original meaning. Mm-hmm. And again, that highlights the flexibility of the Baha'i system.
Right.
Again, there are some similarities. Obviously, we do care about some level of coherence and consistency. We don't want assemblies to be making arbitrary decisions, but of course they're not, because their point of reference is, of course, Baha'i law and guidance from higher institutions. So they're not just creating law from scratch like the common law judges in England were. So we have that protection already that helps their decisions be fair and just and more coherent.
Right.
And that's important. Assemblies need to pay attention to making sure, for example, they're treating like cases alike and so forth. But at the same time, they're free to look at all the particular facts and circumstances of any given situation.
Right. In that sense, we have principle instead of precedence.
Yeah, very good. Very well put. That's right.
Because we have clear principles, and if we're not sure how to apply them, we can ask the House of Justice. And it had not occurred to me that precedent is particularly important because we're talking about a time when laws were not based on legislation,
right,
per se. These were the body common law. They were the uncommon understanding of what was right and what was wrong, which would vary from place to place. So that's really that's a good point. I don't see any other questions specifically about law. And I was particularly interested in focusing our discussion today on that. So I want to invite other people to offer other questions that specifically relate to the issue of law, if they have any, so that we can continue or wrap it up otherwise. I don't see any others right offhand. Well, let me see if there's anything over here too. No, not right there. We've gone pretty much about the amount of time we usually go also. So, Brian, thank you so much. This has been a very, very interesting session, and I've learned quite a lot. It's been very illuminating, and I think everyone else in our audience also has enjoyed it greatly, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of people watching it in the future. As I mentioned to people already, we'll have another session exactly 2 weeks from now at 2 o'clock Eastern Time with Roshan Danesh, talking about Baha'i law, I think from a more theoretical point of view than from a sort of overview of the different layers and types. So it should complement it quite nicely. And so again, thank you very much, Brian, for this marvelous presentation. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. So with that,
thank you.
And we will.
And I'll just reiterate, if there are follow-up questions, I have this screen here with my email address and phone number. So,
good. And we will also be putting this PowerPoint up on the web page for this particular web talk, and we will have the recording up on YouTube in 24 hours or so. So people will be able to watch it and refer their friends to it as well. So thanks everybody very much, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks.